When most people hear the word democracy, I think we automatically picture the biggest parts of it. Presidential elections, Congress, Supreme Court decisions, big national moments, which makes sense because those are the parts we hear about constantly. They feel important because they are important. But I've been thinking lately about how easy it is to slowly start seeing democracy as something that mostly happens somewhere else, somewhere far from regular life. Like it lives in Washington or on cable news or during election season. And then the rest of the time, we mostly just watch it happen. I think that's part of why so many people feel powerless right now. Because if democracy mainly exists in those giant moments, then an ordinary day starts feeling politically meaningless. But the older I get, the more I think that's incomplete. Because democracy obviously depends on laws and institutions and elections. Of course it does, but it also depends on the behavior of ordinary people, the day-to-day habits we create around information, disagreement, attention, and participation. And I don't mean that in a cheesy, inspirational way. I mean it pretty literally. If millions of people get used to reacting to headlines without slowing down enough to really understand what they're reacting to, that changes the environment all of us are living in. Not overnight, but gradually. People become more emotionally reactive because emotional reactions are what they keep seeing around them. The same thing happens with disagreement. If the loudest and harshest voices get rewarded with the most attention over and over again, people start internalizing that. Even subconsciously, they start feeling like calm conversation doesn't accomplish anything anymore. And after a while, you start noticing those same patterns showing up in all kinds of places. Not just in politics, you see them online, at work, around the dinner table, in everyday conversations. People seem quicker to assume bad intentions, quicker to get defensive, less willing to sit inside disagreement for very long. I don't think that started in one single place. I think politics influences culture. Culture influences politics. Technology changes how we interact. Stress changes how we respond to each other. And all of those things keep feeding back into one another. It all kind of feeds into itself over time. And I think a lot of us can feel that happening, even if we don't always know how to describe it. The same thing happens when people completely disengage because politics feels exhausting or hopeless. Leaders notice that too. Not because they're secretly studying every individual person, but because attention patterns shape incentives. If people stop paying attention after elections, there's less pressure to explain decisions clearly or stay connected to the public once the campaign is over. And none of these shifts usually happen in one dramatic moment. That's probably the biggest thing I've been realizing lately. Most civic culture gets built slowly, not through one dramatic moment, through the things we do over and over again until they start feeling normal. Which means strengthening democracy may have less to do with one huge heroic act and more to do with the smaller choices we repeat so often they eventually become normal. And that's what I want to talk about today. Not politics as entertainment, not those people in Washington, just the everyday behaviors that quietly shape the kind of country we all end up living in together.
From anyone, we stand American together.
One of the biggest misunderstandings we have about democracy is thinking it only shows up during elections. I understand why. Those are the moments that get most of the attention, and for good reason. Elections are important. They're also easy to see. Everybody knows when one is happening, and the stakes often feel very clear. But think about your own life for a second. Most of us run into the results of local decisions all the time. A road gets repaired, a school changes a policy, a new building goes up in town. We notice the outcome. What we don't always notice is everything that happened before that outcome. The meetings, the discussions, the people who showed up, the people who didn't, the decisions that had to be made along the way. And because we usually only see the final result, it's easy to miss that democracy was part of the process the whole time. A lot of it happens in the quieter moments between elections. And I'm not saying that to make anyone feel guilty. I'm including myself in this. There have been plenty of times when I've paid a lot of attention to an election and almost no attention to what was happening locally. I think a lot of us do that because the national stuff is louder. It's easier to find. It's covered constantly. And let's be honest, sometimes it's a lot more entertaining. But democracy doesn't disappear between elections. It keeps moving whether we're paying attention or not. Decisions get made, meetings happen, people participate, or they don't. And over time, those ordinary moments start shaping what our communities look like. The comparison that comes to mind for me is a garden. Most of us understand that a garden doesn't stay healthy because you water it once in a while. It stays healthy because somebody keeps paying attention to it. Not obsessively, just consistently. And I think democracy works a lot like that. It doesn't require us to spend every waking hour following politics. Most people don't want to do that. And I don't necessarily think that's healthy anyway. But it does require some maintenance. Maybe that looks like paying attention to an issue that affects your community. Maybe it's learning a little more about how a local decision gets made. Maybe it's showing up when something matters to you or asking a few questions before deciding nothing can change. None of that feels dramatic, but that's kind of the point. Most of the habits that strengthen a democracy aren't dramatic. They're ordinary, which is probably why it's so easy to underestimate how much they matter. Sometimes we think our actions only matter if they feel big, but most systems are shaped by what people do consistently, not occasionally. Truth check. Let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed how two people can look at the exact same event and walk away with completely different impressions of what happened? I know I have, and sometimes it isn't because one person is smarter than the other. It isn't even because one person is lying. A lot of the time, they're simply starting from different information. One person may have seen the whole story, while someone else only caught a short clip online. Or maybe they both encountered the same facts, but one saw them in a calm article, and the other saw them through a post designed to provoke a strong emotional reaction. And that matters because the way information reaches us can influence how we understand everything that comes after it. That's why I think one of the most overlooked civic habits has nothing to do with voting. It has to do with how we handle information before it becomes an opinion, a conversation, a vote, or a decision. Think about it this way. The information we take in shapes what we think is happening. And what we think is happening influences what we believe should be done about it. That's the connection I want us to see. Information doesn't just sit in our heads as facts. It becomes part of how we make sense of the world around us. It influences what grabs our attention, what concerns us, and what solutions seem reasonable. So when people are working from different information, they're often starting from very different understandings of the problem itself. So when information is accurate, we're not guaranteed to agree. Democracy has never required everyone to agree, but accurate information gives us a shared starting point for the disagreement. And I think that's important because sometimes we assume we're arguing about solutions when we're actually starting from completely different understandings of what happened in the first place. Once those understandings begin to shift, behavior starts shifting too. People may support different policies, trust different institutions, or respond differently to the same event. Some become more hopeful, others become more fearful. And when enough people start moving in the same direction, systems respond. That's why information habits matter so much. Not because every post changes the world. Most don't. But patterns do. We've talked about patterns before. One dramatic headline probably won't change much by itself. One misleading post usually won't either. But when the same message keeps showing up over and over again, it starts to feel familiar. And once something feels familiar enough, it can begin to feel true, even if we haven't taken the time to verify it. That's where the internet makes life a little tricky, because the information that spreads fastest isn't always the information that helps us understand something better. A lot of the time, it's the information that creates an immediate emotional reaction. Maybe it makes us angry, maybe it scares us, maybe it feels like proof that we've been right all along. Whatever the emotion is, it grabs our attention before our thinking has fully caught up. And I've fallen for that too. I've seen a headline, felt that emotional surge, and wanted to react immediately. I think most of us have, which is why one of the healthiest civic habits we can develop is surprisingly simple. Slow down, pause, not forever, just long enough to give our thinking a chance to catch up with our feelings. Long enough to ask, do I actually know this is true? Have I looked beyond the headline? Am I reacting to facts or am I reacting to a feeling? And I know that doesn't sound very exciting. Nobody is going to make a movie about someone calmly opening a second source before sharing a post. But healthy democracies depend on people who can tolerate that brief moment of uncertainty, people who are willing to pause long enough to look a little deeper before deciding what they think. Being informed isn't about reacting faster. It's about being willing to understand more before we react. Truth check. Now let's talk about something that probably doesn't sound very political at first. The way we talk to each other. Because when most people hear the word democracy, they think about elections, laws, government agencies, and institutions, and those things absolutely matter. But the more I've worked on these episodes, the more I found myself coming back to something much simpler. Democracy only works if millions of people who don't agree with each other can still share the same country. And when you think about it that way, disagreement isn't some sign that democracy is failing. It's actually part of the design. We're all coming into these conversations with different experiences, different priorities, different ideas about what problems need to be solved and how to solve them. In a democracy, that's expected. In fact, it's one of the strengths of the system. We don't all have to think alike in order to live together. The challenge isn't whether disagreement exists. The challenge is what we do when we run into it. Because it's pretty easy to be open-minded when somebody already agrees with us. The harder moment is when they don't. When somebody says something that immediately rubs us the wrong way or reaches a conclusion that seems completely wrong to us. That's usually where the real test begins. And if you're thinking, well, that's easier said than done, I agree. I've definitely had moments when curiosity was the last thing I felt, especially when I'm frustrated or worried or when the issue feels personal. Those are the moments when it becomes very tempting to stop listening and start assuming. We tell ourselves we already know why they think that way. We already know what kind of person they are. We already know how the conversation is going to end. Sometimes we're right, but sometimes we're not. And I've found that asking one more question often tells me more than making one more assumption. The reason I think this matters is because we don't suddenly develop better conversation skills when the stakes get bigger. If I struggle to stay curious with a friend, a family member, or someone online, I'm probably going to struggle when the disagreement involves something much larger. Those habits get practiced long before they get tested. They get built in ordinary conversations. Sometimes it's the moment we realize we're reacting to what we thought someone meant instead of what they actually said. Sometimes it's catching ourselves halfway through a response and recognizing we haven't really listened yet. Those little moments don't feel important at the time, but that's where the habit gets built. Now, I'm not talking about avoiding disagreement, and I'm certainly not suggesting we pretend every idea is equally good or accept harmful behavior. I'm talking about recognizing that disagreement and destruction are two different things, because once every disagreement turns into a battle that has to be won, people stop listening. And when that happens, solving problems gets a lot harder. Not because differences exist, but because nobody is willing to stay in the conversation long enough to work through them. It's easier to feel certain than curious sometimes. I do that too. But curiosity keeps the conversation open long enough for understanding to have a chance. Truth check. I think another thing that keeps people from participating is the feeling that they don't know enough. Maybe you felt that before. I know I have. You hear people talking about an issue and they seem to know everything. They can quote studies, court cases, historical examples, statistics, and before long you're sitting there wondering if you're even qualified to have an opinion. I've had that feeling more times than I can count. I still have it sometimes, because no matter what topic we're talking about, there is always going to be someone who knows more than we do. There will always be someone who has spent more time studying it, working in the field, or following it closely. Once I realized that, something else occurred to me. If knowing everything was the requirement for participating, almost nobody would qualify. That's not how democracy was designed to work. The expectation was never that every citizen would become an expert on every issue. The expectation was that ordinary people would pay attention, keep learning, and stay involved long enough for their experiences and concerns to be part of the conversation. I'm not saying facts don't matter, they do. And I'm certainly not saying we shouldn't make the effort to understand issues. What I'm saying is that learning and participation were never meant to be two separate things. Most of us learn by participating. We ask questions, we listen. Sometimes we discover we misunderstood something. Sometimes we run into information we hadn't considered before. And yes, sometimes we change our minds. I don't see that as failure. I think that's what learning looks like. In fact, I'd much rather live in a country full of people who are still learning than one full of people who are convinced they've already figured everything out. And there's another reason this matters. When thoughtful people stay silent because they're afraid of being wrong, the conversation doesn't suddenly become more informed. It keeps going without them. The people who are most comfortable speaking aren't always the people with the best information. They're often just the people most willing to speak. That's one reason participation matters. Not because every citizen needs to become a policy expert, but because no single person sees the whole picture. One person notices how an issue affects small businesses. Another sees how it affects schools. Someone else sees how it affects veterans, farmers, parents, retirees, or people with disabilities. That's one of the strengths of democracy. We bring different experiences to the table, and together those experiences help create a fuller picture than any one person could create alone. We're probably never going to agree on everything. That's just reality. What matters is whether people stay engaged long enough to contribute what they know, learn from what others know, and keep working through disagreements together. And that only happens when people stay engaged. When people hear the word participation, I think a lot of us immediately picture voting. And voting is important, but participation shows up in plenty of smaller ways too. Sometimes it's taking an extra minute to verify something before sharing it. Sometimes it's asking a question instead of repeating a rumor. Sometimes it's having a respectful conversation with someone who sees an issue differently than you do. None of those things make headlines. Most of the time, they don't even feel particularly important in the moment. But when millions of people develop habits like that, they shape the culture that democracy operates within. And that's why I think these everyday actions matter. Not because they're dramatic, because they're repeated. Over time, they help keep the system connected to the people it's supposed to serve. Democracies don't stay healthy automatically. They stay healthy when ordinary people remain involved, even when they don't know everything, even when they're still learning, and even when they occasionally get things wrong. I think that's something most of us are already capable of. Sometimes we tell ourselves we need to know everything before we participate, but most of the time, participation is one of the ways we learn. Truth check. One of the themes that keeps showing up in American Together is that we tend to focus on big moments, big elections, big headlines, big controversies, big decisions, and those things matter. Of course they do. But the more I've worked on this project, the more convinced I've become that a lot of what determines the health of a democracy happens long before any of those moments arrive. It happens in the habits we practice every day. It might be something as simple as how we respond when information makes us angry, or what we do when we run into a disagreement with someone we care about. Sometimes it's deciding whether to stay engaged when something feels frustrating instead of walking away from it. Those choices usually don't feel very important when we're making them. Most of the time, they're small, private moments that nobody else even notices. But they don't stay isolated. Over time, those individual choices become patterns. And when enough people repeat the same patterns, they start shaping the culture we all live in. That's why I've come to believe that strengthening democracy isn't only about what we do during elections or major political moments. It's also about the habits we're building in all the ordinary days in between. After everything we've talked about today, I'm curious, which everyday habit do you think has the biggest impact on democracy, but doesn't get much attention? And is there one civic habit you'd personally like to strengthen? I'll be reading. This week, choose one moment when you're tempted to react automatically. It could be a headline that irritates you, a social media post that gets your blood pressure up, or a disagreement that catches you off guard. Instead of reacting immediately, pause long enough to make a more intentional choice. Then pay attention to what happens next. Did that small pause change the conversation, your understanding of the situation, or even the way you responded? This channel isn't about censoring or forcing people to agree. It's about slowing down long enough to really listen, understand different perspectives, and approach discussions with thoughtful reflection together. I welcome different views, I really do. I learn from them, but respect matters here. If you disagree, explain why. If you see it differently, share your perspective. Here, our differences are strengths, and they're starting points for deeper understanding, not weapons. And if you'd like a little extra help shaping your reply, I've linked my 3 Ps in Action comment edition in the description. It's the same process I use myself to pause, pinpoint truth, and proceed with purposeful forethought. Don't worry about reading all this here. The full list of sources is in the description and on my site, American-Together.com. I share them because checking sources matters just as much as checking headlines. Maybe one of the biggest mistakes we make is assuming that democracy is something that only happens in the largest, most visible moments. Because by the time those moments arrive, a lot of the groundwork has already been laid. It's been laid in thousands of ordinary decisions that most of us barely think about at the time. What we pay attention to, what we share, how we treat people who disagree with us, and whether we stay engaged when things get frustrating. And culture influences the kind of country we end up living in. That's why everyday actions matter. Not because each one changes everything on its own, but because millions of small choices repeated over time eventually become something much bigger than any one of us. Hit the thumbs up, share this with a friend, and join the conversation in the comments. Together, we're not just watching, we're building something. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And I'm really glad you're here. Remember, pause, pinpoint truth, proceed with purposeful forethought. Join the conversation. See you next time.